Chapter 1, Peter. When Peter was just 12 years old, he had an unforgettable encounter with a young girl named Tricia. As he walked through the park one sunny afternoon, he heard the sound of someone crying. Following the noise, he saw a petite figure in distress, frantically running away from a vicious dog. His heart racing with fear, he quickly realized that the girl was no more than 8 years old. Without a second thought, Peter jumped into action. He grabbed some stones from the ground and threw them with all his might at the dog until it ran away yelping. As soon as the danger was gone, he rushed to the girl's side, embracing her tightly and wiping her tears away. "I'll always be here to protect you," Peter promised her, determined to be her hero. From that day forward, Peter and Tricia became the closest of friends. They would spend hours exploring the park, playing games, and sharing secrets. And no matter what, Peter was always there to keep his promise and keep Tricia safe. The summer sun beat down on Peter and Tricia as they spent their days exploring the nearby river, climbing trees, and chasing each other through fields of wildflowers. What had started as innocent playtime had quickly turned into something more. Their conversations had become more animated, their laughter more infectious, and their adventures more daring. Peter couldn't help but feel drawn to Tricia's infectious energy and unbridled curiosity. And Tricia, for her part, seemed to light up whenever Peter was around. As the end of summer approached, Peter's heart sank at the thought of leaving Tricia behind. 2 months had flown by in the blink of an eye, and he couldn't imagine going back to his mundane routine without her by his side. On the day of his departure, Peter sat inside the car with his head pressed against the window, staring longingly at Tricia. She was standing on the curb, waving goodbye with tears in her eyes. As the car hurtled down the dusty road, Peter watched as Tricia became smaller and smaller in the distance. Peter's mind was in a whirlwind of emotions. The ache in his chest was almost too much to bear, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of despair. As the car turned a corner and Tricia disappeared from view, Peter slumped back in his seat, feeling numb and helpless. The reality of his departure had finally sunk in, and he knew that he would miss Tricia more than he had ever missed anyone before. The flight back to the U.S. was long and arduous, but Peter hardly noticed. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Tricia and the memories they had made together. He replayed their conversations, their laughter, and their adventures in his mind, desperate to hold on to every detail. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Peter landed back in the U.S. He was greeted by his family, but his heart wasn't in it. All he could think about was Tricia. Peter looked back on their incredible journey. He couldn't help but reminisce about that serendipitous moment in the park. It was a chance encounter that kick-started their extraordinary bond, and it felt like fate had intervened to bring them together. Chapter 2, Tricia. Tricia's heart swells with pride as she surveys her reflection in the mirror. It's been a long journey since she first dreamed of becoming an engineer like her father, and she's worked tirelessly to make that dream a reality. Her short wavy hair frames her face in a way that exudes confidence, and her white-collared uniform only adds to her professional look. She knows she looks good, but more importantly, she feels good. As she makes her way to City Hall, Tricia can't help but feel grateful for the opportunities that have come her way. The hustle and bustle of the city surround her, but she's focused on the task at hand. Today is another day at work, another chance to make a difference in her community. When she arrives at City Hall, Tricia dives straight into her work. As the assistant city engineer, she has a lot on her plate. She's constantly juggling meetings, phone calls, and paperwork, but she does it all with ease. Her attention to detail and work ethic have earned her a reputation as a rising star in the department. But despite her success, Tricia can't shake the feeling that something is missing. She longs for someone to share her achievements with, someone to hold her hand and tell her that everything will be okay. She's tried dating, but nothing has ever quite clicked. There have been sparks, sure, but never anything that's lasted. As the day wears on, Tricia finds herself getting lost in her thoughts. That's when she notices him, the handsome young man staring at her intently. It's as though he's trying to memorize every detail of her beauty, and Tricia can't help but feel a little self-conscious. Interrupting her thoughts, the young man spoke up, asking if he was in the right place to apply for a building permit. Tricia was immediately struck by his soft voice and undeniable charm. Tricia's professionalism kicks in, and she helps him with the application. Even though she was at work and had other things on her mind. She's definitely drawn to this intriguing stranger. Tricia smiled warmly at Edward as she handed him the claim stub. As Edward took the stub from her, their hands briefly touched, sending a jolt of electricity through Tricia. She quickly pulled her hand back and tried to compose herself, but she couldn't help but feel a little flustered. "Thank you. I'm Edward, by the way," said the man. "Nice to meet you, Edward." "I'm Tricia," she replied. As Edward turned to leave, Tricia helplessly watched him go. There was something about him that intrigues her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they're meant to meet. Over the next few days, Tricia finds herself thinking about Edward often. She can't get his charming smile and kind eyes out of her head. She wonders if he's thinking about her too. At last, Tricia decides to take matters into her own hands. She pretends to do a routine inspection of Edward's construction site, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. As Tricia arrived at the construction site, she was struck by the impressive scale of the project. The gusts of wind whipped through the construction site, sending dust and debris flying in all directions. Edward's crew was hard at work, unloading heavy bags of cement from a towering truck. The 6 men grunted and strained as they heaved the bulky bags onto their shoulders, sweat glistening on their foreheads as they navigated through the chaotic scene. The men worked tirelessly, each movement purposeful and determined as they battled against the elements and the unforgiving machinery. Amidst the commotion, the clanging of iron bars echoed through the air. The deafening sound reverberated through the site as the bars were hoisted high into the sky by the crane, their steel frames glinting ominously in the sun. Tricia's heart fluttered in her chest as she nervously scanned the area. She didn't want to come across as too forward, but she just had to see him again. When she finally sees him, her heart quickened its beat, pounding hard as she laid eyes on him. There he is, the man who's been occupying her thoughts. Edward stood tall and proud, wearing a navy blue shirt that hugged his chiseled frame. His deep-set eyes and dark brown hair were the perfect complement to his striking features. Edward had spent most of his life in the United States, but he returned to the Philippines to be with his father, who was eager to retire there. The decision came after the loss of Edward's mother, and his father wanted to spend his remaining days in the land of his birth. Taking a deep breath, she confidently walked up to him. "Hey, Edward," she greeted him with a warm smile. "Hi, Tricia," he replied, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. Tricia explained to Edward the purpose of her visit. As Edward gave her a fascinating smile and handed her a hard hat, her attention quickly shifted to him. He was ruggedly handsome, with brown eyes that seemed to hold a world of mystery and knowledge. As they made their way to the elevator, she felt a gentle touch on her elbow and turned to see Edward holding her arm, guiding her into the elevator. As they ascended to the upper floors, Tricia felt her heart throb with anticipation. She occasionally steals glances at Edward, admiring the way his muscles rippled under his shirt as he pointed out various aspects of the construction. She could see the passion he had for his work shining through his eyes, and she felt herself being drawn to him more and more. After hours of touring the site, Tricia was surprised to find that the time had flown by. It was nearly lunchtime. Edward invited her to have lunch with him at a nearby canteen, and she accepted, feeling a flutter of excitement in her stomach. Over lunch, they talked and laughed, their conversation flowing effortlessly. Edward's charm and wit put Tricia at ease, and she found herself completely forgetting the purpose of her visit. All she could think about was the way his eyes lit up as he spoke, and the sound of his deep, rich laughter. As they finished their meal, Tricia knew that she didn't want the day to end. She wanted to spend more time with Edward, to get to know him better. And as they said their goodbyes, she wondered if there was a chance for something more between them. As the days pass, they get to know each other better. Tricia and Edward realize that they share a deep connection. They both love their work, their families, and their city. They're drawn to each other's intelligence, beauty, and independence. Edward courts Tricia with sweet gestures like surprise flowers and romantic weekend getaways, always finding new ways to make her smile. Edward was drawn to Tricia's intelligence, beauty, and independence, while Tricia was charmed by Edward's kindness, thoughtfulness, and sense of humor. After years of dating, Tricia has grown to know and love Edward more than anyone else in the world. They've built a beautiful relationship filled with love, trust, and laughter. And as time goes on, Tricia can't imagine her life without him. Unknown to Tricia, Edward had been meticulously planning the most romantic proposal to make all her dreams come true. With every detail carefully thought out, Edward led Tricia to their favorite spot by the lake. The water shimmered peacefully with the majestic mountains as its backdrop. The moon shone bright, casting a mesmerizing glow, and the stars twinkled like a million fireflies in the sky. As they sat on a soft blanket, wrapped in each other's warmth, the serene surroundings filled them with tranquility. Suddenly, Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, delicate velvet box. Tricia's heart thumped with excitement as Edward got down on one knee and presented her with a glittering ring. It was a moment she had dreamed of for years, and now it was finally happening. Overwhelmed with emotion and love, her eyes full of excitement, she said yes, without hesitation. Edward bent forward and wrapped his arms around her, and they shared a passionate kiss, surrounded by the romantic ambience of the evening. From that moment on, Tricia knew that she and Edward would spend the rest of their lives together, building a love that would stand the test of time. Chapter 3, Wedding Day. Tricia's mind was lost in a dreamy haze when she was interrupted by her hairstylist's persistent voice. Thoughts of becoming Mrs. Rivera consumed her, and she couldn't wait for their lives to intertwine forever. "You're going to be the talk of the town," Josh exclaimed. Their wedding day was a true fairy tale brought to life. The ceremony took place in a breathtakingly beautiful setting, surrounded by their nearest and dearest. The bride looked stunning in her gown, and the groom's eyes shone with pride and love as he took her hand. The celebration was filled with laughter, joy, and dancing. The couple was showered with heartfelt wishes and blessings as they set out on their journey together as husband and wife. From that day forward, they faced every challenge and rejoiced in every triumph together, building a life filled with love, happiness, and adventure. Chapter 4, A Picture-Perfect Family. As the months passed, the couple's love for each other grew stronger with each passing day, and their excitement for the arrival of their baby intensified. Finally, the moment they had been eagerly anticipating arrived. They looked into each other's eyes, their hearts beating with joy and anticipation, as the doctor placed their newborn son in their arms. The warmth of his tiny body against their skin, the softness of his delicate features, and the purity of his innocent gaze filled their hearts with an overwhelming sense of love and devotion. Tears of joy streamed down their faces as they embraced the new life they had created together. At that moment, they knew that they would do everything in their power to protect their precious son and give him the best possible life. As they held him close, they whispered his name into his ear, savoring the sound of his first coos and giggles. Their family and friends joined in the celebration, showering them with love and congratulations as they welcomed their little prince into the world. The couple's hearts were full of gratitude, and they felt blessed to have each other and their beautiful new addition to their family. With every passing day, they watched their son grow and flourish. Erictifer was the light of their lives, bringing them endless amounts of love and happiness. They spent countless sleepless nights tending to his every need, but it was all worth it just to see his smile and hear his laughter. As Erictofer grew older, they cherished every moment with him, from his first steps to his first words. They celebrated his milestones with pride and joy, always encouraging him to follow his dreams and be the best version of himself. And through it all, their love for each other only grew stronger as they navigated the challenges of parenthood together. With their thriving careers and an adorable son to call their own, Edward and Tricia seemed to have it all. Their family was a vision of happiness. Edward's business was booming, and Tricia had decided to stay at home and devote herself to raising their beloved son, Erictofer. As a family, they cherished their time together and made sure to prioritize their values. They attended church every Sunday, finding solace in their faith, and made sure to carve out time to visit Edward's father, who had chosen to retire in the peaceful countryside. Erictofer loved spending time with his grandfather, and the feeling was mutual. The older man would regale the little boy with stories of his own adventures and impart his wisdom to the young child. The bond between grandfather and grandson was a precious one, and it brought joy to the entire family. Looking back on their journey, they knew that they had been blessed with a life filled with love, happiness, and endless possibilities. And as they looked towards the future, they knew that no matter what challenges they may face, they would always have each other and their precious little Erictofer to light the way. Chapter 5: A Family Tragedy. Edward and Tricia's fairy tale life was short-lived. Without warning, Edward and his father were tragically taken away from the idyllic life of Tricia and their 7-year-old son, Erictofer. It was as if fate had dealt them a cruel hand. The devastating loss of not one, but 2 cherished family members left Tricia and Erictofer reeling. Their world turned completely upside down. Tricia, consumed by unimaginable grief, tried to make sense of their once beautiful life, which has now crumbled and shattered into a million pieces. She was plunged into overwhelming grief, and she found herself drowning in a sea of unbearable sadness and despair. In the midst of her mourning, Peter, Edward's brother, returned home from the United States to pay his respects to his family. But what Tricia didn't know was that Peter was more than just a grieving relative. He was her husband's brother, and as they reunited, the spark between them was undeniable. Despite the fact that Peter was a married man and Tricia was still mourning her loss, they soon found themselves caught up in a dangerous and forbidden love affair. Peter was a devoted family man, and Tricia was still reeling from the loss of her beloved husband. But their hearts were drawn together in an irresistible passion that they couldn't resist. Their story is one of heartbreak, love, and the complicated nature of human emotions. Will they be able to navigate the challenges of their situation and find happiness without hurting anyone? Chapter 6: Peter and Tricia's Reunion. After the burial of Edward and his father, Peter flew back to the United States, but he couldn't forget about Tricia. His mind was constantly consumed with thoughts of her, and he found himself making frequent trips back to the Philippines to be with her. Their affair continued, even though they both knew it was wrong and they felt guilty and ashamed. Despite the risks and consequences, they couldn't help the way they felt about each other. Their passion burned like a fire that they couldn't put out, drawing them together like magnets. It was an addiction they couldn't break, a craving they couldn't resist. They knew they were playing with fire, but the pull of their attraction was too strong to ignore. As the weeks turned into months, their love affair deepened, and they found themselves struggling to keep their feelings for each other hidden from the rest of the world. They stole secret moments whenever they could, stealing kisses and whispering sweet nothings to each other in quiet corners. But as their relationship continued to grow, Tricia began to realize that she couldn't keep living a double life. She knew that what she was doing was hurting Peter's family, and she didn't want to be the cause of any more pain. With a heavy heart, Tricia broke things off with Peter, telling him that they could never be together. Peter was heartbroken, but he knew that Tricia was right. He couldn't continue living a lie, and he didn't want to hurt his family any more than he already had. For months, Tricia and Peter stayed apart, both struggling to come to terms with the end of their affair. But despite their best efforts to move on, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were meant to be together. They knew that their love was real and that they couldn't deny their feelings for each other forever. Peter knew that he had to take a chance and tell Tricia how he felt. He couldn't go on living a lie, pretending that their affair meant nothing to him. He reached out to her, confessing that he still loved her and that he was divorcing his wife to be with her. Tricia was hesitant at first, afraid to take a chance on love again, but she couldn't ignore the way her heart leaped at the sound of his voice. Slowly but surely, they began to rebuild their relationship, taking things one day at a time. It was a slow process, and there were many bumps in the road, but they were determined to make it work. They took things one day at a time, building trust and communication. They knew that they had to be patient and understanding with each other. Finally, after months of uncertainty, Peter's divorce was finalized, and he was free to be with Tricia. But as much as she was excited about the future, Tricia couldn't help but feel a tinge of guilt. She knew that their happiness came at the expense of Kate and Carol's pain, and it weighed heavily on her heart. But she pushed those feelings aside, telling herself that she and Peter deserved to be happy too. They were reunited, ready to start a new chapter of their lives together. They knew that they still had a lot of work to do, but they were willing to put in the effort to make their relationship work. Chapter 7: Peter's Family. Carol and Kate were devastated when the divorce was finalized. They had hoped that Peter would come back to them, but it was clear that his heart belonged to Tricia. Despite the heartbreak of losing her husband to Tricia, Carol refused to give up on what was left of her shattered family. She poured all her love and energy into trying to make things work with her daughter, Kate, hoping to salvage some sense of normalcy in their lives. Carol knew that she couldn't force Peter to come back to her if his heart wasn't in it, but she could still try to be the best mother possible for Kate. She worked hard to create a stable and loving home environment for her daughter, hoping to make up for the pain of losing her father to another woman. But even with all her efforts, Carol couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sadness and loneliness. She longed for the love and companionship that she had shared with Peter, but she knew that she couldn't force someone to love her. Kate's heart ached with a pain she had never felt before. The shock of her father's decision to leave them for another woman left her feeling lost and alone. She couldn't understand how her once happy family had become so shattered. She felt betrayed and abandoned, and the tears wouldn't stop falling. How could her father do this to them? How could he choose someone else over his own family? The questions swirled in her mind, tormenting her every waking moment. She was filled with a fit of burning anger toward Tricia. She blamed her for ripping her once happy family apart and for taking away the love and attention of her father. She was struggling to come to terms with the reality of the situation. It was a heavy burden to bear for a young girl, and the pain was almost unbearable. But deep down, Kate knew that her father still loved her and that he would always be there for her, no matter what. She just wished that things could go back to the way they were before Tricia came into their lives. Carol sat down with Kate and held her close. She knew how much her daughter was hurting, and it broke her heart to see her in so much pain. "Kate," she said gently, "I know this is hard for you, but we have to let your father go. If he loves Tricia, we can't stand in the way of that. We have to be strong and accept the situation, as painful as it may be." Kate looked up at her mother, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to scream and lash out at the unfairness of it all, but deep down, she knew that her mother was right. Her father deserved to be happy, even if it meant being with someone other than her mother. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Kate knew that it was time to accept the reality of the situation and move on. Chapter 8: Tricia and her son's migration. With the divorce now final, Peter faced a difficult choice. He couldn't leave his life in the U.S., but he also couldn't bear to be separated from his beloved Tricia. They had to find a way to be together, and the only option was for Tricia and her son Christopher to move to the U.S. Peter was ecstatic about the prospect of having Tricia and Christopher with him in the U.S. He had missed them terribly since he had returned home, and the thought of being reunited with them made his heart sing. Erictifer was also excited about the move. He had always wanted to see the United States and experience its culture. He was thrilled about the opportunity to start a new life in a new country. Tricia's heart was heavy with uncertainty as she contemplated the daunting decision to leave everything she knew and loved in the Philippines for an uncertain future in a foreign land. It was a difficult choice, but her love for Peter made it easier. Despite her fears and reservations, Tricia knew in her heart that being with Peter was worth the risks and sacrifices. She knew that their love was strong enough to weather any storm, and she was willing to do whatever it takes to be with him. The thought of being without Peter was unbearable, and she couldn't imagine living her life without him by her side. So, with a heavy heart and a strong determination, Tricia made the decision to leave her homeland and start a new life with her son and the man she loved. Excitement and nerves filled the air as Peter prepared and submitted the paperwork for the petition. His heart raced with anticipation. Would Tricia and Erictifer be able to join him in the U.S.? He could hardly wait to find out. There were many hurdles to overcome before they could be together. The immigration process was long and complicated, and they would need to gather a lot of paperwork to prove their relationship was genuine. They would also need to apply for a visa and go through an interview process. Tricia and Erictifer spent months preparing for the move, packing up their belongings, and saying goodbye to their friends and family. They were both nervous about what the future held, but they knew that they had each other to rely on. Finally, after months of waiting, they received the news they had been waiting for: their visas had been approved. They were overjoyed and relieved, knowing that they would soon be reunited with Peter in the U.S. The journey was long and tiring, but when they finally arrived, they were greeted with open arms by Peter. It was a beautiful moment, and they knew that they had made the right decision to be together. The three of them started their new life in the U.S. together, facing the challenges and joys that come with starting anew in a foreign country. There were times when they missed their old life, but they knew that they had each other, and that was all that mattered. Chapter 9: Peter's Death. Their love was passionate and genuine, and they built a beautiful life together. But fate was not on their side. It was a moonless night, and the air was thick with ominous energy as Peter and Tricia stepped out of the bar. Suddenly, a man who was clearly drunk and spoiling for a fight stumbled towards them, his eyes gleaming with malice. He started hurling insults at Tricia, and before Peter could even react, the man brandished a broken bottle and sliced Peter's throat. Blood spurted out of the gaping wound, and Peter fell to the ground, gasping for breath. Tricia was frozen with horror, watching helplessly as her beloved partner lay dying in front of her. She crawled towards him, her heart pounding with fear and despair, and held him close, begging him not to leave her alone. But it was too late. Peter's life had been cruelly snatched away from him, leaving Tricia adrift in a sea of grief and pain. As she held Peter's lifeless body in her arms, the world around her seemed to spin out of control. Her mind was consumed by a maelstrom of emotions: fear, anger, disbelief, and a crushing sense of loss. The man she loved with all her heart was gone, taken away from her in a senseless act of violence. Tricia's screams echoed through the dark and lonely streets, piercing the stillness of the night. She felt as if her heart was being ripped out of her chest, and her tears flowed like a river. The world had become a bleak and desolate place, and she couldn't imagine how she could go on living without Peter by her side. Tricia's pain was an unquenchable flame that consumed her from the inside out. The loss of Peter was a deep wound that refused to heal, leaving her feeling like she was just existing rather than truly living. The world around her seemed to blur, the colors muted and the sounds muffled as if she was living in a foggy dream. Every breath felt heavy and laborious, as if she was carrying an impossibly heavy weight on her chest. Despite her best efforts to put on a brave face, her anguish was palpable, radiating off her in waves that seemed to fill every room she entered. It was as if the very air was charged with the weight of her grief, a suffocating presence that refused to be ignored. And then, to add to her unbearable suffering, Kate appeared. Kate's emotions over her father's death were a tumultuous storm of anger, sorrow, and confusion. She was consumed with grief, struggling to comprehend how her beloved father could have been taken from her so suddenly and violently. But beneath the sorrow, there was a seething anger, an unquenchable fire fueled by her belief that Tricia was somehow responsible for her father's death. When she learned that Tricia was with him during the attack, she couldn't control the anger that coursed through her veins. In her eyes, Tricia was the reason her father was gone, and she didn't hesitate to let Tricia know it. When Kate finally saw Tricia, she couldn't contain the fury that was building inside of her. She stormed towards Tricia, pointing an accusing finger, and let out a stream of hurtful words that she knew she couldn't take back. The accusations flew like daggers, each one piercing Tricia's heart and adding to the burden of her grief. She tried to explain that it was a random act of violence and that she had no control over what had happened, but it was like talking to a brick wall. Kate's anger was all-consuming, and she directed it all toward Tricia. She knew it wasn't fair to blame Tricia for what happened, but the pain of losing her father was too much to bear, and someone had to pay. She blamed Tricia for not protecting her father, for being the reason he was in that situation in the first place. In her grief, Kate was blinded by anger, and she didn't realize the impact her words were having on Tricia. Tricia was completely caught off guard by Kate's sudden outburst. She couldn't comprehend why Kate was blaming her for something that was out of her control. The weight of the accusation was too much to bear, and Tricia felt like she was suffocating under the weight of it all. She had just lost the love of her life, and now she was being blamed for his death. The pain was unbearable, and she felt her heart give out under the immense pressure. Days later, Tricia suffered a heart attack that took her life. Some say it was the shock of Kate's cruel words that triggered the attack, while others speculate it was the overwhelming grief of losing Peter. Whatever the cause may be, the tragic events of that night left an indelible mark on everyone involved. It was a haunting reminder of the dangers of unbridled anger and violence, and how words can cut as deep as any weapon.